Good morning. Welcome to the Graduate Institute, and welcome to Geneva. Compared to many global policy capitals, Geneva is a relatively small city. The urban center has just about 500,000 people, but it is an intensely cosmopolitan place, with 190 nationalities, and about 30% of its population comes from abroad. There are 35 international organizations based in Geneva, and 400 NGOs, and many private foundations and global companies. So in one way or the other, many people who work here work on global understanding and also on resolving and preventing violent conflict. So when Bruno came up to me and said, "Would you like to give a talk about Geneva's role in peace diplomacy?" I obviously said yes. But then I started wondering, where do I start? Do I start from Geneva, or do I start from the outside, from the many places of conflict and violence? I've been living in Geneva for about 15 years now, doing research and running a network of peace-building professionals. And I have come to understand that the best way to capture Geneva's international role is from the outside in. First, starting to understand the characteristics of violence and conflict in different times and places. So, allow me to unpack the international role of Geneva by taking you on 4 short journeys. The first is from Solferino to Geneva, to set out the origins of Geneva's international role. The second is from New York to Geneva, to highlight its history in multilateral peace diplomacy. Then I would like to take you from Aceh to Geneva, to underline Geneva's role after the end of the Cold War. And finally, from Rio de Janeiro to Geneva, to think about the future landscape of violent conflict. So, to get started, let's put our clocks back to the 24th of June, 1859. This is when a Geneva businessman traveled to the village of Castiglione del Stivieri in the present-day Lombardy region of Italy. He was urgently seeking a concession, a land concession from Napoleon in Algeria. Coincidentally, in the same region, Austrian and French troops had just ended one of the 19th century's most bloodiest battles. Our businessman witnessed the agony of thousands of soldiers left to die without medical care. So traumatized by this experience, he graphically depicted this pain and suffering in a book. Now, some of you may have guessed by now who that businessman was. It was Henri Dunant, who is today known as the founder of the International Committee of the Red Cross. His book is called The Memory of Solferino, which still today stands as a powerful reminder of the horrors of war. In this book, Dunant asks 2 questions. One about the possibility to form relief societies, and another one about the possibility to create an international convention to protect the wounded. These 2 questions were the seeds of the international role of Geneva. 5 years after Solferino, the Geneva Conventions were signed and became the founding act of the ICRC. After 150 years, this historic legacy lives on today. Geneva stands for the focus on the individual in international affairs. It is the capital of humanitarian action, human rights, disarmament, and people-centered security. Of course, this Geneva attribute has not had an easy history in a world where international affairs are dominated by states. In 1920, Geneva became home to the League of Nations. It was the first international organization to maintain world peace through collective security and disarmament. It stood for the use of negotiation and arbitration to settle disputes between states. Yet, the League could not uphold these goals in the face of escalating conflict dynamics. Benito Mussolini infamously said that the League is very well when sparrows shout, but not good at all when the eagles fall out. Many states withdrew from the League, and an experiment in multilateral peace diplomacy faltered, until it was reinvented in 1945 when the United Nations were created in New York. This is where we will start our second journey from the outside in, to understand Geneva's role in peace diplomacy. New York became, and still is, the bastion of state-centered international affairs. Peace diplomacy in New York style is primarily about the United Nations Security Council. This is where the P5, the United States, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and France, enjoy the special privileges of veto power. Peace diplomacy in New York means the investment of diplomatic capital to get certain conflict situations onto or off the Security Council agenda. Geneva has sometimes been part of these New York dynamics and a natural stop in larger processes of great power politics. The famous Reagan-Gorbachev summit of 1985 was the first time the US and the Soviet Union held talks on diplomatic relations and the arms race, and it happened right here in Geneva. Local anecdote has it that the US and Soviet ambassadors posted to Geneva spent years together wrangling over disarmament issues, shouting at each other during the negotiations. But after the meetings, they made plans for the weekend together with their families. In a sense, they represent the essence of peace diplomacy, ensuring that your country's negotiation position does not stand in the way of positive personal relationships to other delegates. It is also the combination of thick skin and emotional intelligence to shape lengthy and sometimes undefined processes. Today, great power politics still comes through Geneva, with conferences on Syria, Libya, Yemen, or Iran being recent examples. The legacy of state-centered politics is important to understand Geneva's role in peace diplomacy. There are really few better places to connect with governments on peace and conflict issues away from the policy environment of New York. Geneva counts 174 countries that are represented in over 250 diplomatic missions to various international organizations. With the end of the Cold War, the world outside Geneva changed again. And we continue our journey from the outside in and start from Aceh, a province of Indonesia that saw a brutal civil war. Aceh stands, of course, for the over 30 civil wars that marked the post-Cold War period. Around that time, I did my research for my PhD on the financing of rebel groups. And you can imagine that with this sort of topic, finding interview partners is sometimes a little bit tricky. But doing it at the Graduate Institute and here in Geneva, it did not turn out to be all that difficult. Because through various connections, I was able to contact both active and former rebel group members and do some interviews with them. And the interesting thing I found out was that they knew Geneva quite well, because they had been here at one stage for informal conversations. For me, these were my first encounters with the discrete world of peace mediation in Geneva. By the early 2000s, the optics on peace and conflict had changed from the preoccupation with interstate wars to a preoccupation with civil wars. Peace diplomacy had shifted to the realm of non-governmental organizations because many governments or international organizations were ill-suited for discrete mediation roles with non-state armed groups. In the post-Cold War period, then, Geneva was a stop within larger processes to end civil wars. But unless you have your fingers a little bit in the pie, you don't really see how much is really going on. This is a discrete world, and confidentiality and face-to-face interactions are still the crucial tools of the trade to create trust between conflict parties. This legacy helps us to understand yet another facet of Geneva's role in peace diplomacy. Geneva stands for the use of negotiation and dialogue to prevent and resolve violent conflict. It is possibly the only place with first or second degree channels of communications to any armed actor anywhere in the world. This builds on Switzerland's legacy of neutrality and good offices and mediation roles. It also builds on Geneva's humanitarian tradition. It means constantly creating spaces for dialogue and negotiation. And after 9/11, these spaces have become under specific pressure, especially when negotiation and dialogue was necessary with groups that are labeled terrorists, criminals, or warlords. These pressures have also raised the strategic value of Geneva's connectedness and became a battle for peace professionals to protect the space for dialogue and negotiations. So we have gone from the Battle of Solferino to a state-centered world, superpower politics, and civil wars. Each era has shaped its legacy for Geneva as a center for peace diplomacy. But the world of violent conflict is never stagnant. And as we speak, we are facing yet again a new landscape of violent conflict. This is where I would like to invite you onto our last journey, from Rio de Janeiro to Geneva. Rio stands for many non-conventional conflict settings, where as many people die as in traditional war zones. Acapulco, Johannesburg, San Salvador, or Marseille could be other cities. It is the world of chronic and criminal violence that kills at least 5 times more people than terrorism kills globally, but does not get a lot of media attention at all. Geneva has played a very important role in shaping global understanding about these new conflict dynamics, and it has done so through evidence-based research building on its tradition of people-centered security. For instance, over the last decade, the Small Arms Survey, an organization based in this building, showed the human cost of small arms is much bigger than the human cost of big arms. Up the road, at the United Nations Refugee Agency, the trends in forced displacement are registered, and they show that there are currently 60 million people that are affected. This would be the world's 24th biggest country if all of these people would reside in one territory. The World Health Organization and the Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development estimate that about 500,000 people die each year. This means a city like Geneva wiped out every year. It means a dead body every minute, or about 12 dead bodies since I started talking. So I think these figures demonstrate that our optics is different if we are looking at violent conflict from a people-centered perspective or through a state-centric lens. They also show that peace diplomacy is a very serious business, which can translate into saved lives or dead bodies. Now, these figures also say something about Geneva. There are few better places to access expertise and know-how relevant for peace diplomacy. This feature underlines Geneva's role as a knowledge lab and a practice lab. And this role will become ever more important as the future landscape of violent conflicts changes rapidly and requires new responses. And allow me to bring in a personal example here. Over the last few years, I coordinated research towards a white paper on peace building. And during this work, we have identified several new trends. For example, unofficial peace diplomats. There are now around the world thousands of individuals from all walks of life who are engaged in peace diplomacy at their own personal risk. There are many stories of peace leadership from cities, from businesses, or from women. But too frequently, their stories are not heard in global policy capitals. Another trend we found is the one of mini-lateralisms. This approach describes alliances across sectors and institutions in specific settings to tackle violent conflict peacefully despite a volatile environment. Hundreds of armed violence reduction and prevention initiatives in Latin America are a case in point. Or the at least 35 ceasefires in Syria that have occurred before the recent bombing campaigns. These trends reflect a strategic landscape where power has become more diffuse. There is a growing number of actors that play an ever more important role in peace diplomacy, be they state, non-state, regional, or subnational actors, or organizations with no specific geographic feature definition. Within this new strategic landscape, Geneva has a role to play. As a connecting hub, to all actors relevant for conflict and peace, as a convening place to prevent or resolve violent conflict through dialogue and negotiation, as a knowledge lab for evidence-based research and practice. And I would add that Geneva is playing a crucial role as a docking station for peace practitioners looking for non-violent solutions to violent conflict. In a statement last month, the president of the ICRC, Peter Maurer, said that we have entered a new era and it is not a peaceful one. I think he's right. But I strongly believe that what is happening in Geneva, in this connecting hub, convening place, knowledge lab, and docking station, should inspire people that it is possible to resolve violent conflict through dialogue and negotiation. Thank you very much.